Stanford University.
So thank you all very much for being here. Not to sound too much like the airlines, but I know you have choices today, and appreciate you, flying with me. So what I want to do today is talk to you, as the slide says, about how gender stereotypes influence emerging career aspirations, and then towards the end of my comments, talk a little bit about what we can do about this. This is a common lecture that I give in my sociology of gender class. It's also something that I have given around the country in various forms at places like the National Council for Women in Information Technology, at the AAUW, at the Microsoft Corporation, and National Science Foundation. So, and I'll talk a little bit about why those organizations care about this question. But really, what's motivating the discussion here for me today is trying to understand why it is that some forms of inequality, gender inequality, persist. For example, one thing that we know is that the gender wage gap continues to exist and hasn't shown a whole lot of improvements in the last, say, 10 or 13 years. And so I want to look at how it is that stereotypes contribute to the kinds of careers people enter into, because the careers people enter into have a great effect on the wages that they earn. I think that the talk today is also going to help us understand something about the so-called glass ceiling, the barrier that women face as they think about moving up into management positions and the like. So it'll be important for these reasons. And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about science and engineering professions in particular, and talk about how stereotypes depress the movement of women into science and engineering, and perhaps enhance the movement of men into those fields. So that's what's motivating the talk. And so I want to focus then on how gender stereotypes influence people's emerging career aspirations and the kind of career decisions they make. And underlying the whole lecture today is going to be this point right here, that if we're trying to understand why it is that people end up in one career over another, why they choose to, say, go into accounting instead of engineering, this is a complex process to be sure, but as a minimum, I think we can assume that while there are many reasons why individuals might prefer one career over another, as a minimum, they must believe that they have the skills necessary for that career in order to develop preferences for the career. So what I'm going to be focusing on is understanding how our sense that we do or don't have skills in some domain, how those assessments come about. So as this figure shows, I'm going to be focusing on the way that stereotypic beliefs affect the assessments that are made of our competence in various domains, and then how those influence our emerging career aspirations and decisions. And the argument's going to be here that gender stereotypes, beliefs that women are better at some things and men are better at others, are going to subtly shape these assessments and going to, therefore, influence the kinds of career decisions that people make, funneling men into careers that are already pretty male-dominated and funneling women away from those sorts of careers. Now, when I talk about assessments of task competence, I'm going to be focusing on two different kinds of assessments. The first type are what I'll call self-assessments. These are going to be the assessments that we make of our own competence in a domain. So how do you decide that you're good at math, or that you have a good sense of direction, or that you're good with spatial things, or what have you? And the argument here is going to be that gender stereotypes affect these assessments, and I'll show you how. And that'll be kind of the main thing that we talk about. But then I want to talk also about the way that gender stereotypes shape the assessments that other people make of our competence in various domains. So how is it that a stereotype might lead, for example, an employer to see the very same performance as being more indicative of ability when it's performed by a man instead of a woman? So these are the assessments of others. And the other point that I'm going to be making is that all the effects that I'll draw out for you today are going to be stronger whenever we're looking at a task that is more heavily gender typed. So if you think about a kind of task out there that people associate with men, or one that they associate with women, these effects are going to be especially strong. So if you think about sort of, mechanical skills or something like that, that's commonly very male typed, these effects would be stronger for those kinds of tasks. If you think about something like nurturing ability, that's strongly female typed. People believe women are better at these things. So these effects on self-assessments are going to be especially strong in these really heavily gender typed tasks. So what I want to do is spend most of our time talking about the way that stereotypes influence our own sense of whether we're skilled in a given domain. And so there's going to be two main ways that stereotypes are going to influence self-assessments. And what I'll do here is, as I go through these slides, is I like to sort of I might sort of spoil the things and tell you the punchline. I'm going to give you the main finding, and then I'll go back through and show you some of the studies that have been done that support these claims. So the first thing that we're going to see is that negative stereotypes lead to decreased task performance. That is, if you expose someone to a stereotype that a group that they're part of, women, people of color, if you expose someone to a negative stereotype about a person, this actually leads this actually lowers their task performance. Okay, so I'm going to show you some work in the area that's called Stereotype Threat. Most of it developed here at Stanford that really establishes this point. And then the second point that I'm going to make is that negative stereotypes do another thing. That is, they lead individuals to judge their own performance by a harsher standard. So confronted with a negative stereotype, people like you aren't very good in this area, one thing that we tend to do is to judge our own performance by a harsher standard. Okay? So if you put these two things together, I think you could start to see the sort of double whammy, if you will, that negative stereotypes can have, right? If a stereotype makes you perform less well in a domain than you would otherwise, and on top of that, you judge your performance by a harsher standard, you're going to come to see yourselves as having less skill in an area than you actually do have. Okay? And my claim is going to be that when this happens, this is going to cause you to have lower aspirations for that career and be less likely to move into it. Okay, so let's start then by me showing you some of the research or telling you about some of the research that shows how stereotypes actually impact performance. Okay? And the main finding, this research in the area called Stereotype Threat has been going on for decades now. So we have just lots of studies. I mean, of all the things I'm going to put up here, this one's got the most empirical support. It's been established over and over again in a variety of settings. I mean, the main finding is that negative stereotypes lead to decreased task performance. We've seen this. The studies have been done to show how negative stereotypes about African Americans lead to lower task performance on tests of intellectual ability. In our case here, we're focused mainly on gender. There's been quite a few studies that have shown that if you expose women to a negative stereotype about mathematics or spatial ability, these kind of common stereotypes that we hear in the press and elsewhere, that women are less able in these domains, that what happens is that women's performance on tests of mathematical ability or tests of spatial ability are lower than if those very same women were not exposed to a negative stereotype. So this is the kind of main finding, is that you get this sort of decrement in performance, if you will. Recently, we've learned to understand a bit more about why this effect occurs. And the recent research, we're increasingly learning more and more about the way the brain actually works. Somebody, a cognitive psychologist was telling me not too long ago that 90% of what we know about the brain we've learned in the last 10 years. I mean, this is really a very active area of research. But one thing we've learned is about how stereotypes work. And what we're learning is that stereotypes, when a negative stereotype interferes with people's working memory capacity. That is, the part of the brain that would normally be used to do things like solve math problems is not being as activated, and instead other regions of the brain where emotions are being processed, where social knowledge is being processed, those regions of the brain are being highly activated. And so you can imagine if you're trying to solve a math problem under time pressure and your emotional regions are being activated and your working memory capacity is depleted, this is going to lead you to perform more negatively than you would have if not primed with these stereotypes. We've also recently learned that these effects are larger for higher performers. And what I mean by that is while women in general are affected negatively when you expose them to a negative stereotype, women who have the most, and we'll talk about it in terms of math, women who have the most mathematical ability are affected the most. And the reason people think this happens is women who have a large amount of mathematical ability have a lot of what is commonly referred to as scratch pad memory, almost like you could do problems in your head or something like that. And that's the region of the brain that's most susceptible to stereotypic knowledge. So the effects are, so if you think about this and we're trying to understand why is there a shortage of women in science and engineering, it's especially bad to know that of all the groups that are most affected by negative stereotypes, the ones that have the most ability in those various domains are the ones that are the most affected. Okay, so 2005 finding. A little bit more about what we know. This is going to be later when I get to the sort of good news part about what we can do about it. This part's going to be important. The effects of stereotypes largely occur out of awareness. That is, most people, most women, most people of color, when they're exposed to negative stereotypes, are not aware of the way it's affecting their performance. Okay, and I'll give a couple of examples of this. The first one's kind of a cool study that was done a few years back. It was a kind of a classic stereotype threat study in a way. Women are brought into this laboratory and they're either exposed to a stereotype or not, and their performance on some task is measured. And so what happened in this particular study is the task that they were engaged in was a task that looked kind of like, the video game Tetris, where you're trying to line the shapes up. I mean, it looks sort of like that. So it's a task that looks like it has something to do with spatial ability. You have to reorient objects and get them into a certain orientation. Half the women in the study were exposed to a stereotype that women have less spatial ability than men. Okay, so they were made aware of that before they started playing this Tetris-like game. Women in the other condition were instead exposed to a stereotype that women are better at taking the perspective of others. And so, if you think about Tetris, you're having to take the perspective of the shape that's falling down. I guess this could be relevant to this task. So this is a positive stereotype that women were exposed to. You get the kind of classic effect that decades worth of studies have shown here, and that is that women exposed to the negative stereotype made 14% more errors than women in the positive stereotype condition. So it decreased their performance. That's the classic kind of effect, so nothing surprising there. The two things that are kind of new to this study, one is that while women were playing this Tetris-like game, they were in an fMRI brain imaging machine, and we were actually getting to take pictures of what was going on in their brain as they're playing this particular game. And it was very clear from comparing the brain images across these two conditions that, as I was saying to you earlier, that the women exposed to the negative stereotype, the portion of their brain that's used for solving spatial problems was not being recruited as heavily as for women in the other condition. So it was affecting how their brain was processing the information. Okay? Now, to my point that this occurs out of awareness, the researchers then asked the women, we exposed you to this negative stereotype. Do you think that affected how you performed on this task? 90% of the women said there's no way that affected me. Okay, and so this is a lot of the times these things have these subtle effects, and and we're unaware that they're affecting us, even though the brain image thing clearly showed that it had an effect. Now, the second paper that I list here, it shows what the effect could be in a more real-world situation. I mean, so what if people don't play Tetris as well, we might be thinking. But the second one shows a real-world example. And what the authors of this paper show is they did a study where they had people take the AP Calculus exam, an older copy of it from the past. But they take this AP Calculus exam, and they scored the exam afterwards. Half of the women, before they took the exam, filled out the demographic information about themselves before the exam. So they, put down that importantly, they marked a box, gender, female. Okay, so they indicated that they were female before taking the calculus test. The other group of women took the test and then marked the gender box afterwards. And what the researchers of this study found is if they generalized to the larger population of people who took the exam that year, putting that question at the end would have meant that 4,700 more women in the United States would have gotten AP Calculus credit. And you think about this is out of awareness. The subtle priming of gender actually could produce this negative effect. And so, the real-world effects of this are, in fact, there. Okay. Okay. Good news. The good news, and this is something we'll come back to when we're thinking about how to change things. One other thing that we know from this literature is that these effects that I'm drawing out for you are situational, and I'll say what I mean by that. And what I mean is this: stereotypes about gender are sort of ubiquitously out there, right? I mean, if we wanted to spend our hour together, writing gender stereotypes on the board, we could do so. We all know them. We all know they're out there. But the good news is, what really affects people is not just larger stereotypes that are out there, but the beliefs that are salient in their local environment. Okay, and this is going to be a crowbar into trying to reduce these effects, because what this is going to show is that when the beliefs that are salient, when we move different beliefs into our local local environment, performance outcomes will shift. And I want to give you one paper here that shows this, and then I'll come back later towards the end of the comments and talk a little bit about how we can use this information. So this paper here, a little bit older than some of the others, but it's one of my favorite. This is a classic stereotype threat study where women come to the laboratory and they're either exposed to a negative stereotype or not, and then they take a test of mathematical ability and we see what happens. So you can probably by now guess what's going to happen. But what's really unique about this study is that all the women who participated in this particular study were Asian women. Okay, now why is that interesting? Well, Asian women are Asian and they're women. Okay, lost no one there, I'm sure. What that means is Asian women could be primed with stereotypes about gender and mathematics, okay? And we know that stereotypes about gender and mathematics include beliefs that women are less skilled at mathematics, okay? Those are the kind of stereotypes that are out there for gender. You could prime those. You could expose Asian women to that stereotype. Or you could instead expose them to an Asian stereotype. And we know what the Asian stereotypes are about mathematics as well, that Asians are especially skilled at mathematics. So this is what the authors of this paper took advantage of. They brought Asian women to the lab, and half of them were exposed to a stereotype about gender in mathematics, half were exposed to a stereotype about Asians in mathematics, and there actually was a control condition where they were exposed to no stereotype. And I bet you could guess the results at this point in time. The women exposed to the gender stereotype had a decrease in performance compared to the control group. The women exposed to the Asian stereotype had a stereotype lift, we call it. They actually performed better than the control group, okay? So what this shows you is that even though stereotypes about gender and math are out there, everybody knows them, and everybody knows the stereotypes about Asians and math, they're out there and everybody knows them, it's the ones that are salient in people's local environment that make a difference. So if we can get a handle on beliefs in a local environment, we can affect some of these processes. They're not, fatal and going to happen no matter what. Okay, so to summarize what we've looked at thus far then is the way that stereotypes affect performance, okay? And this is important because if stereotypes systematically lower our performance, we're probably going to come to see ourselves as having less skill in a given domain, right? Based on the studies I've showed you, it wouldn't be surprising if women think they have less mathematical ability than they do, okay? Because stereotypes could be undermining their performance. But the second thing that I mentioned earlier that stereotypes do is they also affect the standard that we use to judge our own ability, okay? And so the central idea here, to spoil the punchline, is that negative stereotypes are going to lead us to judge our own performance by a harsher standard, okay? And so if we judge our performance by a harsher standard, that means it's going to take more evidence to convince us we really do have the skill necessary to pursue a given career. So I want to talk about a couple of studies here that I did, and I should say most of those stereotype studies, or a lot of them, that literature all started here at Stanford when Claude Steele was a professor in the psychology department here. And so most of those were done in psychology. The studies I'm going to show you now are some studies that I did here at Stanford back when I was a graduate student getting my PhD here. And so the first study, what we did is we brought undergraduate students into the laboratory, and we had them take a test of something that we told them was called contrast sensitivity ability, okay? Now the thing to know about this task is it's a bogus task. Unbeknownst to the participants, it has no right or wrong answers. Okay, so basically people are looking at these rectangles that have black and white. They're made up of little smaller rectangles that are black or white, and they're asked to determine which color, black or white, occupies more of the area. Now they've been engineered to where they're exactly 50% black and 50% white. So there's, there is not a right or wrong answer to this. So it's a bogus task. Now, why do we do this to people? Well, the reason why is there are a couple things. One, I wanted to be able to give everybody the same performance feedback. I wanted to give them a score and give everybody the same score and see how they would react to that score. That is, if I give you an 80 and you an 80, do you think you're really good at this and you think you're not? I mean, how are you judging your performance from a common score? The second thing is I didn't want anybody to really be better at the task than anyone else. And that's one way to assure that no one's better at something than another. There's no right or wrong answer. You can't be better at it, really. Okay, so we hold performance feedback constant. Then we're going to ask them questions about how they judge their ability, how good they think they are, how much contrast sensitivity ability do they think they have, and what would be their aspirations for a career path if it required them to really be good at this ability. Okay? Now, the key independent variable, the thing we're going to vary in the experiment, is that half the participants are going to be exposed to a stereotype that's male advantaging. That is, half the people are going to hear men are better, social scientists don't know why, but men are better at this task, or men have more of this ability. And the other are going to hear that there is no gender difference in ability. So what do we find? So what we find is in this kind of purplish colored row here, for the participants who heard men have more task ability, we asked them this question. We said, what percentage of these items would you have to get correct for you to feel like you really do have contrast sensitivity ability? So what's the standard you're using here? How much evidence do you need? And notice that men said they would need to get about 79% of the items right to be certain they had this ability. Women, almost 10 percentage points higher. They would need to get 89% in order to think they had this ability. So you can imagine if this ability is crucial for deciding to move along some career path, it's going to take more evidence to convince women they have this ability. Now, usually people start nodding in recognition here and thinking that you'd get this effect no matter what, that this is just kind of a boy competence thing, that men think they're better at everything or something, but that's not the truth. In the other condition of the experiment, participants were instead told there is no gender difference in task ability, and then we asked them how many of the problems they would have to get right, and we get very similar responses here. These are not statistically significant from each other. And so the point here is when the belief that they're exposed to changes, so does the ability standard they're using. Just to follow up, then we asked them, okay, how much of this ability do you have? And they marked, they just have a little slider they drew a line on telling us how much of this ability they have at this fictitious task. And you could see that the men are rating their ability higher than women. This is a significantly higher rating. So they're judging their performance by a more lenient standard and coming to see themselves as having more ability. Whereas in the other condition, there is no gender difference in terms of how they assess their ability. Finally, we ask them about, would you aspire to a path that required this ability? If you were to apply to a graduate program and they required you to take a test of this ability, would you want to go into that grad program? Would you want to go into a job that required this? And what we found is that in the condition where men and women heard that men have more of this ability, men reported significantly higher aspirations for this particular career path. Okay, so they showed more interest in pursuing it. But in the other condition where they heard that there was no gender difference in this ability, there were also no gender differences in the aspirations that they espoused. So again, to summarize kind of the main point across these are situational effects. This is going to be really important. When beliefs in the setting change, so do the ability standards people use, so do the self-assessments that people make, and so do their emerging aspirations. And if we think back to the stereotype threat, so does their actual performance. So these situational beliefs really do matter. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, okay, that was kind of weird. Why did you do this laboratory experiment with a bogus task? And the reason I did this is what I wanted to show is that this general model, that stereotypes influence the standards we use, which influence our assessments, which influence our aspirations, that this model holds even when it can't be the case that men have more ability than women, or men are just more interested in things than women. It rules out the kind of competing explanations that we commonly hear when people ask the question, why aren't there more women in field X? So if you go to any conference about science and engineering, you say, why aren't there more women in these fields? Someone, maybe like the president of Harvard, will offer that perhaps women just don't have the aptitude that women have. Or someone else will offer, well, women just aren't as interested in these particular fields. And my point here is, let's just bracket that discussion. These interest and aptitude explanations, for one thing, they suggest no avenue for change. If we want to increase the representation of women in different kinds of fields that lead to good-paying jobs, social models like the one I'm drawing out here are going to suggest ways that we can do that. And secondly, these explanations are often intractable. It's hard to know if they're right or wrong. What do I mean by that? Well, okay, so we hear a lot about women having lower aptitude in math than men do. How would people even begin to know if that were the case? Well, what they would do is they would go compare the average math test score on some test for men to the average math test score for women. And if they found a difference, they might take that as evidence that men have more ability than women. So let's just stare at this picture for a second. What this is, I would go touch it, but I'm not supposed to walk over there or they lose me in the video camera. So what this is a distribution of scores on the math SAT. And the first thing to notice about this picture, there are two curves here, two humps, and they're almost sitting directly on top of each other. Okay, there's very little difference here. What this is a plot of, over on the left are the people who did unfortunately very bad on the SAT, scoring around the 200, and over there are the people, the Stanford students, right, scoring closer to 800, and then the big point in the middle is where most people are scoring. That's the mean. And what you see is that these curves largely overlapped. The women's curve is slightly to the left of the men's curve, okay? And that's because men score slightly higher on average on the math SAT than women. Okay, slightly. That turns out to be less than 2 questions different on the math SAT, okay? So if we think this is what's driving all the differences in movement to science and engineering, it's a little hard to believe two questions could be like producing that big effect. But nonetheless, this is the evidence that people often use. It's as if they think men are all over here and women are all over here, when what's happening is the distributions overlap a lot. So I think that's an important point to make. Secondly, think about what we just learned about stereotype threat. I mean, this isn't a very big difference. Couldn't the possibility of a negative stereotype be what's producing the difference in this test score? Given that we live in a world where stereotypes are so prevalent, how could we ever know if men are really better at math than women if this is the kind of evidence that we're looking towards? Okay. Now, Larry Summers' point was not about the mean, which is very, very close. His point was about that right tail, the numbers over there close to 800. And what he said, and he's correct about this, is there are twice as many men who score over 750 than women. So of the real high scorers, there's a lot more men than women. Well, 2 things to know about that. One, that's true on test scores in the United States, and the United States only. You don't get that overrepresentation of men in the upper tails in any other country. So that suggests that it's varying with something in the culture. And second, that's also the region where stereotype threat does its biggest damage, okay, amongst the high performers, okay? The second picture here is a way for me to kind of talk about sort of the other explanation that people commonly give for why there are a dearth of women in fields, and that is they'll say that women lack the interest to go into fields. And here, if we think about it, our interests are probably responsive to the kind of opportunities that we see available to us. And so what this is, and I'll make a few points about it, this is the percentage of women who got bachelor's, master's, and doctor's degrees in physics from 1977 to 2006. A couple of points to note about this graph. One, even if we look over on the right side, the most current period that I have data for up there, we see that the values are quite low. Women are underrepresented in physics, okay? Depending on which degree you're looking for, we're in the, 15 to 22% of women are getting degrees in physics. So that's one thing. Their percentages are low. The second thing to note is that the lowest curve is for PhDs, and this is what we always find, is that women are more underrepresented in a field the higher up you go, okay? So that's another thing to note. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is all of those curves are trending upward. Okay? We've spent a lot of time and energy, and the National Science Foundation has spent a lot of money recently encouraging things that promote women's movement into science and engineering, and it seems to be working, even if slowly. So this is to say that we can affect interests if we can figure out what's causing people to be less interested. Okay, so I want to now ask whether this model I've laid out for you, where stereotypes affect assessments, affect early career aspirations, can tell us something about the dearth of women in science and engineering, okay, since we've been looking at a couple of examples of that. So I wrote a paper back in 2001, right when I was finishing up at Stanford, where I analyzed some nationally representative data on over 16,000 students from all over the United States. Okay, so these are students from high schools all over the United States. So now we're not in the bogus laboratory setting where people are doing fake tasks. We've got these real people here. And what we do is we compared how boys and girls with equal mathematical ability assessed their own mathematical competence. So we go through this data and we compare boys and girls who have the same math grades, the same math test scores, and we compare how good they think they are at math. So there were these survey questions that said things like, how good do you think you are at math, okay? And we compare their answers to that. And what we find is that male students assess their mathematical ability higher than their equal ability female counterparts did, okay? People with the same grades, same test scores, boys thought they were better at math than girls did, okay? But again, this is a situational effect. And I wanted to illustrate this. So I go back to the data and I say, well, let's compare how boys and girls assess their verbal ability. Verbal ability is not stereotyped as masculine. But there aren't a lot of beliefs out there that men have more verbal ability. Let's see what happens there. Do boys still think they're, do boys just always think they're better at things, or does it vary situationally? Well, you probably know the answer now because I've been talking for quite some time. What I found here is that female students actually assess their verbal ability higher than boys did with the equal grades and equal test scores. Okay, so punchline, situational. Okay, when beliefs associated with the task change, so do self-assessments. Now, you might be thinking, so what? Does it matter? It does matter. What we show in this same paper is that, this is in a way not surprising, but the better you think you are at math, the more likely you are, the better they thought they were in math in the 10th grade of high school, the more likely they were to take calculus while in high school. So it affected their decision making, okay? Over and above their actual grades, over and above their actual scores, these self-assessments of ability predicted their enrollment in high school calculus. As a matter of fact, it predicted their enrollment in high school calculus better, at a stronger effect than their grades or their actual test scores did. So, how you think about your ability matters. It also increased the odds that we have the same students, we're following them over time. We ask them how good you are in math in 10th grade. We look and see what kind of classes they take in high school. Then we go and look at what they're doing in college, and we find that the better students thought they were in math, the more likely they were to choose a major in science, math, or engineering once they got in college. So part of the gender gap in enrolling in these majors comes about because boys think they're better at math than girls do, controlling for actual ability. Just a few other examples to throw out. This is, I've been talking a lot about science, math, and engineering. I do a lot of talking about science, math, and engineering, but you find this in other male-typed fields as well. I just read a cool paper that looked at jazz improv. Women are way underrepresented as jazz musicians, and authors did a study, found a very similar thing. Again, controlling for the scores they had received in their performance, men thought they were better at jazz improv than women do. Lately, a student of mine wrote a paper looking at how people assess their entrepreneurial ability, and again found the same thing, that even amongst highly successful entrepreneurs, men think they have more entrepreneurial skills than women do. Entrepreneurship is heavily male-typed. If you read some of the descriptions of it, it sounds like we're describing Rambo warriors or something. A surgery student here at Stanford just did a study of medical surgery residents where they go into Stanford's sim lab, where this is like a simulation of surgeries, which is really neat because the patient could be, you have a fake patient that looks like he's dying, and that's better than having students working on actual patients who are dying. And they can sort of see how they're doing and grade their performance. And here again, they found that the male surgery residents thought they were performing better in these simulations than did women performing at the exact same level. It's an interesting study, actually. The men and women make different kinds of errors because of this. Women make errors that where they don't intervene quickly enough in the surgery, and men make errors because they're overconfident and how quickly they intervene. And both can have really bad effects. It'd be better to hit that right on the target instead of acting too late or too soon. So my student wanted to conclude that it'd be nice to have a male and female surgeon simultaneously working on you. Maybe it would average out. Okay, so that's kind of the bad stuff, right? It sort of suggests the way that these stereotypes reproduce the existing patterns we have. We have very few women in science and engineering, and that's and that props up beliefs about who's good in these sorts of things, which affects people's aspirations and their decision making. And voila, out the other end, we have very few women in science and engineering in time too. So we might be thinking about what can be done about this. And so that's what I want to kind of conclude with is talking about what can be done. And so just a few underlying principles that I'm going to show you some examples of and then stress. And that is the kinds of biases that I'm talking about, these biases in assessments, often occur out of awareness. So we got to bring decision making into awareness. So that's going to be one of the things I'm going to be talking about. These biases are more extreme in uncertain situations. When people don't know how to make sense of performance information, it's as if they use gender stereotypes to fill in the gaps, if you will. So in uncertain situations, stereotypes have a bigger effect. The third point, okay, I've made it 14 times already, but we'll make it one more. The impact of stereotypes change when beliefs in the local setting change, okay? And then the last point, stereotypes also bias the standards of gatekeepers, okay? They don't just bias the assessments people make of themselves, but they bias the assessments that other people make of us. And I want to just show you a couple of pieces of scholarship that establishes this point, because it's going to be really important in thinking about what to do. And so there's 4 things. One study showed, for example, that when evaluators were evaluating students for an engineering internship, women were judged by a harsher standard, okay? The very same profile, if it had a woman's name on it, was judged by a harsher standard by people who were evaluating people for an internship position, okay? So it's the stereotypes affecting the judgment of the gatekeeper there, the person who's making the decision. Yeah, that's a good question. You occasionally but rarely find that the gender of the rater matters. That women and men, we all live in the same world. We all are exposed to the same stereotypes, and in these kinds of evaluative decisions, you very rarely find a difference between male and female raters. It's a good question. The second study showed that another way that stereotypes work is they affect the criteria that people use when evaluating men and women. And the way this study worked is really kind of cool. People were evaluating someone for a job as a police chief. Okay, so that's heavily male-typed, a police chief. And in one condition of the experiment, they had 2 applicants that they were looking at. One had more street skills, okay, and the other had more education. Okay, so that's 2 things that might matter as a police officer. You might want to know they have some experience and some education. In this first condition, there were no names on the applicants, okay? So you just had A and B here. And what they found is that the evaluators tended to prefer the police chief who had more education. They thought that was more important. Okay, fine. Education's a perfectly legitimate criteria for screening someone. Then they do another condition of the experiment, and they put a man's name on the applicant who has more education and a woman's name on the applicant who has more street smarts. And again, they found that people preferred they preferred the applicant with more education, who happened to be the man this time. And when they asked him why, they said, well, he had more education. Okay, so that's why we preferred him. Okay, fine. Nothing nefarious going on here yet. But the third condition, yes, you could probably all guess this now. In the third condition, they just switched things around. Now the man's name is on the applicant that has more street smarts, and the woman has more education. Okay, guess what happened? They preferred the man still. And when asked why, they said, well, he has more street smarts. So this sort of showed the way the criteria were shifting around to sort of provide legitimate support for the decision that was being made. So we know that stereotypes can shift criteria. The third point, this was the one that I always like to talk about when I'm teaching, there's a study of student evaluation of professors that show that female professors are judged by a harsher standard. Okay? Now let me tell you a little more about this. It's actually a little more complicated than that. So you may know this, but when professors give students better grades, okay, professors get better course evaluations, okay? There's a real strong correlation there. And we could say why we think that is, maybe the professor did a better job and that's why the students got better grades. We could debate what's going on here. So that's, we love the messenger when they give us a positive message. And as long as female professors and male professors give students good grades, there's no gender difference in how the professors are rated. But for the students who get negative grades, okay, they're getting negative performance information, they've gotten a lower grade in the class, now female professors take a bigger hit from that, okay? They get more negative course evaluations when they give low grades than when male professors do. So it shifts the standard there as well. And the final point is that women leaders often experience a double bind. And what I mean by this is when people hear that women are being judged by a harsher standard, one natural tendency for women in leadership roles or women in male-dominated roles is to want to assert their ability. Don't deny my competence. I'm really skilled at this. But when that happens, that kind of assertive behavior tends to make women less liked. Okay, so the research has shown that in a lot of male-type fields, and especially in leadership, women can either appear not very competent, but people we really like them, or they can appear very competent, but we don't like it. You get one way or another. You're either seen as competent or liked, but not both simultaneously. So stereotypes are difficult in that way. Okay, why do I point all this out? Well, the reason I point this out is if we want to affect change, we need to understand that stereotypes affect not only people's own judgments of their competence, but they also affect the judgments of others. So it's not going to do a whole lot of good to just go in and say to women, wake up, don't be so hard on yourself, judge yourself by a more lenient standard, only to have them go out into the world where other people judge them by a harsher standard. Okay? We have to attack the fundamental problem, and that is the gender beliefs that are in the environment which are affecting individual women, but are also affecting the people that evaluate them. So we must change the gender beliefs that are operating in the organization, not just individual women's beliefs. So as I'm fond of saying, we have to fix organizations, not fix women. So what can be done? I want to give you 3 examples, and then I'll conclude with sort of what these examples illustrate. Oh yeah, I do. Although if I want to actually a little faster, if I would allow you to have time for questions. So a couple of examples of things that have worked. There was a study, the first study that was done here. This was you might think I made this talk just because it has lots of Stanford scholars in it, but it's just a lot of the stereotyping work in the country has really been done here. This study was done at Stanford, like lots of the others. And what this study did is it recruited to the study women who were in math, science, and engineering majors at Stanford. Okay, so people who were already sort of pretty committed to math, science, and engineering. That's who was brought into the lab. And then they further selected out of that already elite group women who highly identified with mathematics, thought they were especially good at it. Okay, so you've got the rare air here. You've got women who are at a great university in science and engineering, and they think they're good at math. And they were shown videos about a leadership conference in science and engineering that they were told that Stanford was going to host. Okay? And then they were asked how interested they would be in attending this leadership conference. So, what are their aspirations for leadership in this area? Half the students saw a video that had equal numbers of men and women in it. Okay, so the various engineers you saw doing things and the students and all this, half men, half women. The other half saw a very unbalanced video, okay, where women were really underrepresented. Other than that, the content of the video was the same. And what they found is that the women in the balanced video showed significantly more interest in going to the conference than did women who saw the unbalanced video. Okay? And there were physiological responses as well. They collect things like skin conductance and other sorts of things that sort of get it, this sort of, are you feeling like you don't really fit in here kind of thing. And so it got physiological responses across the two conditions as well, with women in the unbalanced condition where they saw very few women showing heightened sense of stress. They're more cognitively vigilant. What that means is they're looking around at their setting and noticing everything in the environment. And so this study really shows, I think, how important it is to portray images that suggest that people belong. I'm going to skip the second one just because of the interest in time, and I'll talk about the third one very briefly. This study, Unlocking the Clubhouse, Women in Computing, was a 5-year project where the authors of this study did extensive interviews over time and collected all kinds of other data for men and women who were computer science majors at Carnegie Mellon, so one of the top computer science programs in the nation. When they started this project, there were 7% women in computer science at Carnegie Mellon. And that was in 1995. By 2000, there were 42%. Okay, so they did something that really affected what was going on. And one thing they learned and then really started to work on is expanding the image of what a computer scientist is. It was very clear from their interviews that all the students associated computer science with people who had this sort of passionate obsession with computers and didn't want to do anything but try to hack into computers, and they just kept using the word geek, 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 geek to describe people that were in computer science. And so all the men and women saw that as that's what computer science is. And then they asked people, well, do you fit that image? Does that describe you? Is that who you are? And they found that 3/4 of the men said that image did describe them. Not all the men, but 3/4 of the men, but only 1/3 of the women. Okay, so the women were reporting much less that they really fit into what the image of computer science was at Carnegie Mellon. And so the authors of this study set about doing a variety of things to say, we've got to expand this where people see computer science, not just computers, okay, computer science for all the things that it can do in the world and portray it more accurately. I mean, people, out there working in computer science are not just sitting around hacking into things all night long. If we present a wider range of activities, women are going to be more interested in this major. And they concluded we don't need to fit women into computer science, we need to change computer science, and to great success. So what can organizations do? These are the sort of summary points here. The first thing I always recommend is organizations have got to control their message, okay? What are the gender beliefs that are operating in your organization, okay? Certainly it does not help to go around saying that you think that men maybe, have a natural aptitude for something and women lack it. That would be a very irresponsible thing to say. What are the gender beliefs that are operating in your organization? How do you present yourself, okay? Presenting computer science more broadly produced a positive effect. The video that had women in it produced a positive effect, so control that message. The second point, make performance standards clearer and communicate them more clearly. When people don't know what to do, gender stereotypes fill in the gaps. And so, some studies that have been done of science and engineering find that at lots of places, it's not at all uncommon for students' averages on exams to be like in the 30s or something. That is a very ambiguous signal that you're sending to students. Students don't know. I mean, you think about that. If you got a 30 on a paper, you wouldn't quite know what to do with that. Smart person don't get 30. And so in these kinds of situations, stereotypes can really do their damage. And one particular study here that always makes me think this is really important was a study that was done of 5 different science and engineering programs around the country. And based on the description of techies and fuzzies, I think Stanford may have been one of them. And what they found is that when women dropped out of science and engineering, and they asked them why, the women would say, because my grades aren't very good. Okay? And then they compared the women's grades to the men's grades. And what they found is that the women who were dropping out of computer science had higher grades than the men who stayed in. Okay? So their grades weren't good, but they were better than the guys who were staying in. Those kinds of ambiguous stimuli, ambiguous performance information really create problems. We need to not just assume people are going to know how to interpret their scores, but to really teach that kind of tacit knowledge about what kind of performance is acceptable in this environment. And then the final thing I think is really important is holding gatekeepers accountable for gender disparities. It's very important that the people who are trying to increase the representation of women in various fields pay attention to how you're doing, because when you see things start to fall off, it's important to stop and ask about how the policies and procedures that we're doing affect the kinds of decisions that we make. I have this slide up here. When I do this in class, my students always, you think about it, they're college students, they're in the process of deciding what kind of careers they want to have. So they're always like, how does this affect me? And so this is this is my last slide that I usually show to them, and that is, what can you as an individual do if you're a young person sitting in a class? And I think it's really important to learn about how stereotypes might affect your own career decision making, is what I tell them. That it's when you start to feel like maybe I don't have the skill to do something, stop and think about where did that idea come from? What made you really think that, okay? It's important to know how stereotypes could be influencing our judgments. I think it's important to realize negative feedback is common and can be productive, and not to sort of take the first piece of negative feedback as evidence that you don't have ability. And then promoting organizational change, which is something that a lot of the students here actively work on. When I talk about this in class, I like to show this slide, and this is my very last slide, to show, just to give them a sense of, I talk a lot about science and engineering. What's the representation of women in science and engineering here on the Stanford campus? And and I'll say a little bit about the values, but to get these values, the first person I emailed was a student on campus in engineering in the Society for Women Engineers, and I said, do you happen to know what the percentage of women are in engineering here on campus? And within about 2 minutes, she emailed me back, so she obviously did know it. She didn't have to go do a lot of research, and gave me the figures for undergrad majors, which you can see is 30%. That's higher than average in the country. It's actually really good. This is something I think Stanford does very well on. Graduate students, 23%, faculty, 12%, okay? And so, promoting organizational change, these student organizations I think are really good for kind of keeping our, making a difference here. And I put up the figures for physics and chemistry as well, just so you can sort of see. On all of these, as I said, we've got room to improve here at Stanford, and we talk a lot about that here. But there is a lot of attention to this issue here, and I think relatively doing pretty well. So, okay, we're done then. Thank you all. Great audience.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.